Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about the recent visit of the Republic of Korea's president to the United States. Both President Moon and President Trump talked trade and security issues on the Korean peninsula. Let's get back to our panel right now. Qinduo, I want to get to you. And President Trump recently had a telephone conversation with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. That telephone call, of course, is coming ahead of the G20 summit, which is going to be taking place in just a few days in Germany. The position of the United States president has always been that China needs to do more in resolving these tensions on the Korean peninsula. What exactly is the United States asking of China?
Well, obviously, it seems to the Chinese side, on the U.S. government, there's like a misguided thinking somehow by applying more and more pressure by Beijing on North Korea, and then you can achieve the goal of disarming the country, free the country of nuclear weapons and missile tests. But I would say that's obviously it's like one-sided thinking. That's not really very realistic. Remember, for North Korea, the threat they see from the U.S. side, from South Korea side, is about their existence, is about the survival of the government. So there's an inherent fear on the leadership of North Korea. Unless you can reduce that kind of fear, I think it's even hard, almost impossible to bring them back to the negotiation table. So you have to take that into consideration in order to have a dialogue, in order to really solve this problem. Otherwise, it is very difficult. Remember, this country is very much isolated. If you look at the economy in the recent couple of years, especially past year and this year, you see actually there are signs of stabilizing. There are even signs of a market economy. So as the economy is growing more or less, I don't see sanctions will be working on this country.
Yonho, I want to turn to the other big issue on the agenda when these two leaders met, and that is trade. President Trump made it clear during those talks that he wants South Korea to open its markets more to the United States. Let's take a listen to what President Trump had to say.
I'm encouraged by President Moon's assurances that he will work to create a level playing field so that American workers and businesses, and especially automakers, can have a fair shake at dealing with South Korea.
So how was that issue resolved?
I think from the South Korean government's point of view, this trade issue was well expected. They knew it was coming. And I think the auto industry and the steel industry, they are prepared to address the concerns the Trump administration has been raised. So although the President Trump, he himself raising this issue in front of the reporters, made a lot of people surprised, especially in Korea. I think South Korea is well prepared to address this issue in a very measured way.
Greg, President Trump also threatened to tear up the bilateral trade deal with South Korea. Was that just rhetoric, or I mean, what would be the consequences if he did that?
Right. Well, I think President Trump has talked about this since the campaign. He's talked about how we don't have how the Chorus FTA was not a good deal for the United States and how it needs to be renegotiated. I think there was some disagreement between Trump and Moon Jae-in about trade that happened during the summit. I think if you look at the joint statement that came out afterwards, it's clear that they were sort of papering over the differences a little bit. Both of them wanted the summit to be a success, but at the same time, I do think there are some underlying differences. Moon Jae-in later had said that President Trump's comments about tearing up the free trade agreement were outside of the scope of what they discussed. So my own sense is that there was a little bit of a disconnect between the two leaders. and that there are certain issues that didn't completely get worked out at the summit and that they're going to have to be negotiated going forward. I do think this is an area where the Trump administration is absolutely going to continue to put pressure on South Korea. I think there are ways that South Korea can deal with this. I do think if they, make some highly visible concessions to the Trump administration, that the Trump administration may in turn reduce the pressure. Trump looks for symbolic victories on these kinds of issues that he could show as evidence to his supporters that he's carrying out the agenda that he promised to carry out during the campaign.
Right, Myung, what is your feeling on this? What is your view on this? Are there deep differences on trade issues between the United States and South Korea that's going to require quite a bit of work in the weeks and months ahead?
Yeah. At the decision makers level, I think there are no serious conflicts between the two governments. For instance, American decision makers and the South Korean decision makers, they are fully aware of the fact that trade volume has doubled after the US-Korea free trade agreement, and also cross-border investment has been also doubled. I mean, South Korean investment to the United States has been doubled. It reached more than $40 billion, and then those accompanying business owners of President Moon Jae-in's visit to the United States, they promised that they're gonna invest for the coming 5 years at least $36 billion. So it's a big deal. But at the same time, what we have to understand is that U.S. trade deficit against South Korea is relatively much smaller than, for instance, even U.S. trade relations with Mexico or Canada. For instance, U.S. trade deficit coming from Canada, the trade with Canada is more than $100 billion a year. And then out of total U.S. trade deficit, China portion is almost half of U.S. trade deficit. So in dealing with trade imbalances or trade-related conflict between the United States and South Korea, I think the U.S. government will not push it hard to disrupt existing ROK or U.S. alliance or disrupting the coordination in dealing with North Korea. So my position is that basically dealing with North Korea or security-related issue will be the top priority. And this economic issue would be relatively secondary, and it seems to be primary for domestic political purposes.
Qinduo, when we look at U.S. foreign policy, the foreign policy that we know so far, it certainly shows that President Trump is very tough, very strong, very vocal on trade issues and leveling the playing field, opening foreign markets to U.S. companies. No doubt China will be looking very closely at what is going to happen between the United States and South Korea as far as trade is concerned.
Well, yes, but if you look at this trade deficit on the U.S. side, it's like roughly $18 billion. As the previous speaker pointed out, it's relatively small compared with the U.S. deficit with the other partners here. And besides, of course, for Donald Trump, he prioritized the trade issue a lot, and also he talked about because of the trade deficit, somehow there are U.S. workers out of jobs over there. But if you look at the U.S. economy, which is strong, which is growing rapidly, there's not big problem with the U.S. economy. And that's simply because of his promise, campaign promise. He has to do something with the trade deficit. Remember, in terms of trade, it's impossible to have this like an equal deficit or a complete balance between deficit and supplies.
Right.
So you always have a certain level of supplies, a certain amount of deficit, but usually that's normal. And they talked about a lot about unfair play field. I'm not sure that's not level playing field between South Korea and the United States. Yes, there are more trade between the two countries since the FTA came into being like 5 years ago. But that's basically mutually beneficial between the two countries. you know, for the U.S., probably that's the second most topic that's you know, concerned to the Trump administration, only to say North Korea issue. I think there's a lot of pressure on the South Korean side.
All right, and that's where we have to leave it. Time's run out. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.